The South Dakota-class battleships are a curious bunch, the ultimate expression of treaty battleships in a lot of regards, for better or worse. In previous videos, I've covered two of this class: USS Alabama, with a largely quiet service life, and USS Massachusetts, perhaps best known for her engagement with the French battleship Jean Bart. Today's video will turn to another of the class in the form of USS Indiana. Her service would be more in line with Alabama, but by no means was it uneventful. She would spend 3 years fighting across the Pacific, primarily against Japanese aircraft and shore targets. It's a shame she never had the chance to engage another capital ship, but that's the nature of the Pacific War. Only a couple battleship engagements would occur over that conflict, leading Indiana to be best known for an unfortunate collision with USS Washington. This drove in Washington's bow and left Indiana with a nasty gash torn out of her side. It wasn't pretty on either of the ships. However, this came relatively late in the ship's service life. With this in mind, let's kick things off where it began, with the ship's construction and commissioning. For Indiana, this began at the Newport News Shipbuilding Yard. She was laid down on November 20th, 1939, and launched almost exactly 2 years later. In fact, it was almost down to the day. She was launched on November 21st, 1941. At this point, it was still peacetime for the United States, although that wouldn't last much longer. Within a couple weeks, the United States was drawn into the war, and as a result, Indiana's fitting out was sped up, with the ship commissioned on April 30th of 1942. The South Dakotas were, prior to Iowa, the newest American battleship. It's no surprise the fitting out was sped up. After all, having powerful new ships in service was by no means a bad thing. And the South Dakotas were, if nothing else, very powerful battleships. Those ships displaced around 35,400 tons at their standard loading, with that going up to 44,500 when fully loaded, allowing the ships to carry 9 16-inch 406mm guns and 3 3-gun turrets, a super-firing pair on the bow, and a third turret on the stern, along with a heavy secondary battery, consisting of 25-inch 127mm dual-purpose guns. Those guns were supported by a swarm of 20mm and 40mm guns. Exactly how many varies on the ship and time period, as it often did. Ultimately, it would end up over 100 between the two types. Perhaps the most notable part of this design, however, was actually the armor protection. These ships had a main belt of 12.2 inches or 310 millimeters. The raw thickness wasn't that much higher than North Carolina, but it was far more inclined to 19 degrees, which required an internal armor belt. That made it, in theory, resistant to 16-inch shell fire. Unfortunately, sacrifices would have to be made to remain within the treaty limit. In this case, that came in the speed. The South Dakotas were squat and short by contemporary standards. That resulted in a slower top speed of around 27 to 28 knots on 130,000 shaft horsepower. In any event, though, that rounds off the design details. Now back to the service, which, as I said, began on April 30th, 1942. although that was just the commissioning. The ship needed to finish working up first, which lasted until November 1942. A fairly typical working up period, as all the kinks were worked out and the crew trained. Where things differed for Indiana was what came next. The ship was initially assigned to the Atlantic Fleet. However, in common with a lot of American ships, that would be short-lived. The war in the Pacific was drawing more and more resources in, and Indiana would be no exception. The ship was declared combat ready on November 9th, and she was immediately taken out of the Atlantic Fleet and sent off to the Pacific, transiting the Panama Canal on November 13th before sailing on to Tonga on November 28, 1942. Just the Pacific portion of this voyage was 6,102 miles, or 9,820 kilometers, at an average speed of 19 knots. If nothing else, Indiana had proven her engines could work with no issues. Regardless, after refueling, the ship continued on to the combat area, reaching Noumea on December 2nd, which would be her base through the end of 1942. Although Indiana would set sail on December 5th for a set of training exercises. These were largely uneventful, although Japanese aircraft did shadow the ship starting on December 19th. None of them attacked, but it served as a reminder that the crew was in the active combat zone. The edge of it, perhaps, but they weren't in entirely safe waters. That said, it would still be some time before Indiana directly engaged the enemy. While the Japanese evacuated Guadalcanal in early 1943, Indiana remained well away from the action, with the battleship joining USS North Carolina and USS Washington as part of Task Force 64, under the famous Admiral Willis Lee, which would have been quite exciting in late 1942. In 1943, it meant spending the entire year on various escort duties, either troop escort or the aircraft carriers. Nothing unusual here for the fast battleships. At the same time, it meant Indiana wouldn't directly engage the Japanese until the Battle of Tarawa on November 20th, 1943. It was during operations in the Marshall Islands that Indiana's gunners claimed their first Japanese aircraft. And soon after this, Indiana would turn her guns against Japanese shore targets. When Indiana, alongside other fast battleships, bombarded the island of Nauru on December 8th, something like 800 16-inch shells were fired ashore. When I joke about hating islands out of existence, it's really not a joke. In any case, the rest of December 1943 into January 1944 proved largely uneventful. Indiana conducted various training exercises in addition to escorting the carriers. As a result, nothing much of note would happen until February 1st, 1944. At first, this day went well. Indiana and other American forces bombarded Kwajalein Atoll. Shells were sent ashore while small Japanese vessels attempted to make their escape, a submarine chaser and 5 guard ships, all of which were sunk either by air attack or 5-inch shell fire. Indiana's shell fire also contributed to blowing up 2 Japanese ammunition dumps. However, as day shifted to night, the ship's luck ran out in spectacular fashion. While blacked out for security, Indiana suddenly spotted USS Washington off of her bow. Washington ordered her engines into back emergency full, but it wasn't enough. Washington's bow sliced into Indiana's side just ahead of her starboard catapult. The older battleship cut through about 200 feet of Indiana's hull, taking the armor plating with her. This would result in Washington's bow crumpling, leaving about 20 feet of the forecastle embedded in Indiana's side. 3 men were lost aboard the battleship, with a further 6 wounded, one of which later dying from his wounds. In addition to the gash torn out of her side, Indiana also suffered damage to her starboard prop shaft and the torpedo defense system. While the damage to Washington is more famous, Indiana arguably came out worse. Both ships would survive, with Indiana declared to be at fault for failing to inform other ships about course changes while going to refuel her escorting destroyers. Regardless, Indiana would set sail for temporary repairs on February 2nd, 1944. With those repairs concluded, the ship set sail for Pearl Harbor on February 7th, arriving there on February 13th, where the battleship was dry docked for repairs that lasted until April 7th, 1944. With the ship remaining in Hawaiian waters for a few more days for post-refit trials, with Indiana only returning to the combat area at the end of the month, where the ship took up escort duty with Task Group 58.3 on April 29, 1944. This group consisted of Enterprise, along with Lexington, CV-16, Princeton, and Langley, CVL-27. As part of this formation, Indiana would cover the carriers during raids on Truk on April 29th, and then Ponop on May 1st, 1944. This would establish a pattern for the rest of the war in a lot of ways. Indiana would cover carriers on various air raids, while occasionally putting her own guns to use in shore bombardment. The typical duty for an American battleship by this point of the war, although she was part of the invasion of the Marianas in June 1944, which was rather more exciting. Indiana set up shop off Saipan on June 13, 1944, for the pre-invasion bombardment. This would see the ship fire some 584 16-inch shells over the next 2 days, with the first Japanese counterattack coming on June 15th, though this only resulted in the loss of Japanese aircraft. Admittedly, Indiana did have to dodge a torpedo, but she evaded any damage. More excitement would come a few days later on June 19th in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Marianas Turkey Shoot, which was a bit more exciting for Indiana than most. During the mass Japanese air attacks, another torpedo bomber attacked the battleship. Indiana made a hard turn to evade, but the torpedo ended up exploding 50 yards from the ship. It isn't clear if this was a malfunction or gunfire from the battleship hitting and detonating the torpedo. Either way, it spared Indiana damage, although a second torpedo bomber would be shot down later that afternoon, with this Kate crashing into the battleship, sending debris flying across the deck. Fortunately, damage was minor and no crew were lost in that impact, with Indiana coming out largely undamaged after firing a truly ludicrous number of shells: 416 5-inch, 4,832 40mm, and over 9,000 20mm shells, with her only casualties being 5 men injured by shell fragments. Indiana would remain in the area until early August, when she was sent off for resupply. This concluded by the end of the month but Indiana wouldn't return to action. She suffered engine issues in early September, which sent the battleship off for repair. Those repairs would last until December 1944, which, as a result, meant she missed the Battle of Leyte Gulf. In fact, Indiana didn't return to combat until January 1945, when she reached Saipan on January 20th. 2 days later, she left for the Battle of Iwo Jima, with the battleship setting up off that island on January 24th, once more for a pre-invasion bombardment. However, in Indiana's case, this would prove to be short-lived. She left on January 25th and would remain in port until February 10th, at which point she set sail to cover the fast carriers as they struck Japan itself. The first of these raids came on February 16th, 1945. Another came in March of 1945. In both cases, Indiana occupied herself, fending off Japanese air attack, along with putting her floatplanes to use in rescuing downed American pilots. Her own guns wouldn't see use again until the invasion of Okinawa, with Indiana bombarding the island on March 23rd and March 24th, firing another 180 16-inch shells. While off the island, Indiana would fend off multiple kamikaze attacks. None managed to hit the ship, continuing a streak of good luck outside of that incident with Washington. Arguably, Indiana had worse luck from the weather than any form of Japanese attack, as she ran into Typhoon Connie, or Viper depending on the source, on June 5th. Aside from losing a floatplane, the ship came out with only superficial damage. After this, Indiana continued on her usual missions, at least until July, because in July 1945, the ship conducted her most notable shore bombardment, when, alongside other American battleships, she bombarded Japan itself on July 14th, the first shore bombardment of the Japanese home islands. Indiana would round off the war operating off Japan, either in shore bombardment or carrier escort, with the battleship firing ashore on August 9th, 1945, as her final combat action. Japan would surrender soon after, on August 15th. As for Indiana, with the war over, her service came to an end. The ship moored in Tokyo Bay on September 5th, 1945, where she would process POWs before setting sail on September 15th to return home. While many other ships were used as transports to bring soldiers home, Indiana wouldn't do this. Her third shaft locked up on the way back to California. Repairs for this were combined with her deactivation, with the ship put into reserve in March 1946, where she would remain until scrapped in September 1963. Various refit plans came and went, but ultimately the South Dakotas were simply too cramped for any viable refit. However, some parts of the ship did manage to survive, from an anchor to her mainmast and prow. Moreover, some of her steel found a second use in research facilities at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Not a bad ending, all things considered. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.